Okay, hello and welcome. I'm Dov Waxman. I'm the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA and the Director of the UCLA Yunus and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. And it's my great pleasure to introduce this event. I want to first of all thank you all for joining us this evening for the Nazarian Center's inaugural Yunus Nazarian Memorial Lecture. 1 year ago, Yunus Nazarian passed away at the age of 91. The center owes its very existence to the generosity and vision of Yunus and his wife, Soraya. Thank you, Soraya, who's here with us this evening. To honor his memory and express our gratitude to him and his family, we have established this new lecture series in Israel Studies. In a moment, Yunus and Soraya's daughter, Dr. Sharon Nazarian, will say a few words about her father and his amazing life. I will just say that given Yunus's many contributions to the State of Israel, I think it's particularly fitting to hold this inaugural lecture on this particular day, Yom Haatzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. 75 years ago today, according to the Hebrew calendar, David Ben-Gurion read aloud the Declaration of Independence, officially establishing the State of Israel. Since that historic event, Israel has fought many wars. Millions of Jewish immigrants from all over the world have emigrated to Israel and been integrated into Israeli society. Israel's developed an advanced economy and become a regional superpower, a high-tech hub, a multicultural society, and a source of pride to many Jews, both in Israel and around the world. Of course, Israel, like any country, also has its flaws, and it faces many challenges, internal and external. And in recent months, as we all know, the country has been mired in a ferocious dispute over the government's proposed judicial overhaul, exposing deep divisions among Israelis and fundamental disagreements about Israel's identity. Our distinguished speaker this evening will discuss these divisions and disagreements. I'd now like to welcome onto the stage Dr. Sharon Nazarian, the president of the YNS Nazarian Family Foundation and the chair of the Nazarian Center's Community Advisory Board.
Yom Haatzmaut, Israel's Day of Independence, was always a very special day in the Nazarian household. Our father Yunus, who was born in Iran, made Aliyah to Israel at the age of 17 in 1949 and joined the border police, Mishmar HaGvul, as part of the military service. But more importantly, our father experienced freedom for the first time as an Iranian Jew, born into a culture of prejudice and oppression. That sense of freedom stayed with him even as he returned to Iran in the mid-50s, at the time of the oil boom in Iran, in pursuit of his business aspirations. Back in Iran, he knew that as a Jew, he would not be treated as an equal citizen, nor would he be able to function as a businessman, to be privy to government tenders, and to be able to really reach his zenith. But still, he felt that for his children, they could feel more protected than he ever had. He raised his family steeped in Zionist pride, emotionally and physically connected to his spiritual homeland by building a second home in Tel Aviv, and like so many Jews around the world, confident that Israel would remain a safe haven if and when needed. He achieved great business success in a short amount of time, only to have it taken away by a theocratic and oppressive regime that forced his family into exile as a result of the 1979 revolution, largely because of his ties to Israel, representing large manufacturing companies from Israel. Once moved to America, here in Los Angeles, he built yet another successful business enterprise. He beamed with pride every Yom Haatzmaut when he saw how modern, vibrant, diverse, creative, and innovative the State of Israel had become, fulfilling the generational dream of the Jewish people. He took every step possible in his own limited capacity as a businessman to help the Israeli people, even agreeing to meet Yasser Arafat. That was no small feat, getting him to meet him. Every peace accord signed was celebrated with greatest joy. The Abraham Accords were probably the culmination of his dream come true, like so many Mizrahi Jews who yearned for the day when Israelis and Arabs could achieve true acceptance of one another, not the cold peace of Jordan and Egypt. I think my mother and siblings would agree that the apex of my father's life and career was the day that he lit the torch called Masu'ah on Israel's Independence Day in 2007 in Jerusalem as part of the annual official Yom Haatzmaut celebration, where 12 Israeli citizens believed to have made an outstanding contribution to Israeli society are asked to light the torch representing the 12 tribes of Israel on Mount Herzl. That day was forever etched in all of our hearts as the apex of his dream come true, and for us as a family, a day of true pride. In his final months with us, as his health deteriorated, the only topic I could raise with him that would garner his full attention was either an Israeli achievement or an Israeli crisis. He would sit up, look straight into my eyes, and listen intently as I would describe the latest news out of Jerusalem. This Yom Haatzmaut is special to our family as we mark the inaugural UCLA Yunus Nazarian Memorial Lecture in honor of our father who passed away just a little over a year ago. The patriarch of our family was a strong Zionist who understood the need for Jewish self-determination and the necessity of a Jewish and democratic homeland. Yunus devoted his life and his philanthropic endeavors to ensuring the vibrancy of the state of Israel and its citizens. That is what led my mother, Soraya, and him to name and endow the Yunus and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies that brings us together today. It was because he understood how vital it was for UCLA students and the community to have a rich, deep, and nuanced understanding of the modern state of Israel. In the past few months, I've often asked myself how my father would have reacted to the current crisis facing Israel. As a diaspora Jew, like so many who live in vulnerable communities around the world, in Europe, in Latin America, in the Middle East, and Africa, would he have been hesitant to publicly call out the dangers posed by this government, by this current government, to the very democratic character of Israel? And would he have openly supported the citizens of Israel protesting week after week the undemocratic tactics of the coalition government? What I am sure about is that he would have been both heartbroken by the amount of pain being felt in Israel on this Independence Day, and also deeply inspired by the commitment of Israel's citizens to its Jewish and democratic character. The Nazarian family would like to thank the Nazarian Center, Professor Dov Waxman, and the center staff for honoring my father in this most distinguished annual commemoration. Would also like to show our deepest gratitude to Yossi Klein Halevi for making the long journey to be with us on this very important celebration, and to share his wisdom and persistent voice of reason, compassion, and kindness with us. I know my father would have been deeply touched, so thank you all. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Sharon. Now it's time for me to introduce our speaker this evening, Yossi Klein Halevi. Born in Brooklyn, he moved to Israel in 1982 and now lives in Jerusalem, where he is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Together with Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. He also writes, as I'm sure we all know, for leading op-ed pages in the United States, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and is a former contributing editor to the New Republic. He's the author of numerous acclaimed books. His first book, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, tells the story of his teenage years as a follower of the militant Rabbi Meir Kahane, and his subsequent disillusionment with Jewish radicalism. His 2001 book, At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, A Jew's Search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land, was hailed by the New York Times as, quote, a book of burning importance. His 2013 book, like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year award. And his latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbors, is a New York Times bestseller. I'm sure we're all very happy to have him in our company this evening, and I'm delighted to welcome Yossi Klein Halevi.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Professor Waxman. And Sharon, listening to your beautiful words about your father, I thought you were talking about my father. And my father came from the opposite end of the diaspora as your father. He was a Holocaust survivor. But I think that our two fathers would have gotten along famously, because exactly the same worldview, the same commitments, the same passions. And so I'm really honored to be here and to be delivering the first memorial lecture for Yunus Nazarian. Yehi Zichro Baruch, may his memory be a blessing. The first word that comes to my mind when I think about Israel, the emotion, the word that sums up my emotional relationship with Israel, even more than pride and even more than love, is gratitude. Gratitude, first of all, for being a Jew alive at this moment, at a moment of Shechianu, of blessing for having reached this day and for having been privileged to be part of the generation that was born into the reality of a Jewish state. Gratitude to Israel for having created the largest and most heterogeneous Jewish community in the world. Gratitude to the state that took the Jewish people from the lowest point in our history, which I believe was 1945, to what I believe is the peak moment of Jewish history, despite all of the problems we face, which is today. Gratitude to the Jewish state for teaching us how to defend ourselves. And gratitude for having restored the Jewish people to the place we always thought we belonged in, which is at the center of world events. Front and center stage. We have many, many wonderful qualities as a people. Modesty is not one of them. And gratitude to the state of Israel for embodying the values that the two flags on the bima of most American synagogues were meant to symbolize: commitment to the Jewish people and commitment to democracy. And those two flags, which certainly when I was growing up in this country I took for granted, are really an extraordinary phenomenon, because these are two secular symbols, and yet they are placed at the most sacred spot in the synagogue. They flank the Torah ark. And I think that the Jews, American Jews of the 1940s and 50s, had an intuition, a very profound intuition, which is that these are the two symbols of the Jewish rebirth. These are the symbols of the Jewish Renaissance after the Holocaust. And now these two flags and what they represent are in danger. The entwinement of these two flags are in danger. To be an Israeli liberal in these days is to experience an anguish that certainly I've never known in the 40 years that I've lived in Israel. This is my anniversary, my 40th anniversary. And these last 40 years, some of you might have noticed, were a roller coaster. life in Israel throws everything possible at you, good and bad. And yet I never recall losing sleep the way that I do now. If I wake up in the middle of the night and I suddenly remember, I remind myself what's happening, and I wonder, what is this government going to inflict on us in the morning? The night is over. And this is very common. We've become, at least in my camp in Israel, we've become a nation of insomniacs. And the person I think who most summed up what the anguish of this moment really feels like was the Israeli novelist Eshkol Nevo, who wrote recently that he'll find himself sitting alone in his car in a traffic jam in Tel Aviv and weeping. And I don't think that is an unusual experience. What we're experiencing in Israel is a convergence of assaults. This is the most corrupt, most politically extreme, and most religiously fundamentalist government in Israel's history. Any one of those assaults would be a formidable challenge. Coming together has really brought us to the edge of what feels like the abyss. What was inconceivable 6 months ago has become routine for Yom Haatzmaut. And we're living a kind of inverse reality. A prime minister on trial for corruption has arrogated for himself the right to impose the most far-reaching transformations in Israel's judicial system in our history. A prime minister on trial who has no right to make even justified changes, let alone the kinds of changes that he has put on the table. And let's not call this a judicial reform. This is a revolution. The Supreme Court, which Alan Dershowitz has called, and Alan Dershowitz, no one suspects him of being a left-winger. He was actually close to Netanyahu. Dershowitz called the Israeli Supreme Court the jewel in the Israeli crown. This government has targeted the Supreme Court as an enemy of Israel. One of the two justice ministers that Netanyahu has appointed, and just think about that for a moment. We have two justice ministers because there were spoils that had to be distributed to Netanyahu's loyalists. We have, in effect, two defense ministers, and I don't know, I haven't been paying attention to other ministries. One of the two justice ministers, Dudi Amsalem, recently called for the chief justice of the Supreme Court to be placed on trial for treason, the justice minister of the state of Israel. Moving along to Ben Gvir, Itamar Ben Gvir, whom the army would not draft because it considered him too dangerous to hold a gun. He's now in charge of our police. And the government is appointing, has budgeted what is in effect a private militia for Itamar Ben Gvir. This most militantly nationalist, most right-wing, most hyper-Zionist government in Israel's history is led by men, most of whom didn't serve in the army, or who barely served. We've never had a government led by men, and they're all men, who barely served in the IDF. And yet this is a government that speaks in the name of Zionism and defense. Now, government defenders will say that people like me are sore losers. We're out in the streets, and I've been out on the streets every week religiously. We're sore losers. we can't, we who supposedly are championing democracy can't accept the legitimacy of our elections. And yes, this government was elected legitimately. But I have had no problems in the 40 years of living and voting in Israel to accept governments from left, right, and center. In fact, I have successively voted for left, right, and center, as have many Israelis on the streets today. But a democratically elected government does not have the right to destroy democratic institutions and the democratic ethos. That's the red line. You know, Sharon, when you were talking about how proud your father was about the success of modern Israel, what we're fighting for today is to preserve Israeli modernity. It's to preserve the success of Startup Nation, because that's what this government is threatening. This is the anti-Startup Nation government. Whether it's the ultra-Orthodox or the far right who believe that we were meant to be an isolated and ghettoized people, that to me is the negation of Zionism. For me, this is an anti-Zionist government, precisely because it would undermine Israel's place in the world. And yet, for all the anguish that so many of us in Israel are experiencing, this is one of the most exhilarating moments that I've known as an Israeli. To be out in the streets with literally hundreds of thousands of people who you know have been there for weeks before and you know will continue showing up until this crisis is resolved, until we have managed to definitively protect Israeli democracy, is almost a religious experience. And when you look around, and you've all seen the images of literally tens of thousands of Israeli flags flying in the streets all over Israel. The slogan of this movement is one word, one Hebrew word, busha. Busha means shame or disgrace. And I'll find myself standing next to someone at a demonstration, and suddenly they'll start shouting on their own, busha, busha, with this sense of outrage. How could you be doing this to Israel? How could you be doing this to us? And then suddenly everyone around will take up the chant, busha, busha. And it is so heartfelt. It's coming from that deepest Israeli place of protectiveness for the country. And more than anger, what you experience on the streets of Israel today in the protests is love, deep love for Israel. And I think that Israelis have surprised themselves by how profoundly in love they are with their country. You know, those of you who know Israelis, we can be a fairly cynical bunch. And yet, what you feel on the streets is just unabashed pride in what we've accomplished and absolute determination to preserve what we've built. Let's not, I love applause, thank you, but let's not have applause. It's the issues I feel are too painful. And Tzipi Livni, who is a veteran, was one of the veteran leaders of the Likud, spoke at the Jerusalem demonstration last Saturday night. And she gave a very powerful speech and talking about what the Likud was under Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir and what it has degenerated into today. And people started applauding. And she said, please don't applaud. You're talking about my soul being torn apart. So this is really, I'm sharing with you the deepest angst that we feel in Israel today, and I wish this is not the talk that I had to give here. But what we're experiencing on the streets is an eruption of Israeli patriotism, and we haven't seen anything like this in years, maybe never. The symbol, if the slogan is Busha, the symbol is the Israeli flag, which is really extraordinary, because think about your political divide here. And I think that one of the tragedies of American political discourse is that the flag has been appropriated by one side. And in Israel, the flag belongs to everyone. I just heard a story from someone the other day that a friend of hers was walking in Tel Aviv. She was leaving the opposition demonstration, and she saw coming to her someone with a right-wing T-shirt who was on his way to the pro-government demonstration. And he approaches her, and she's tensing up, and he says to her, "Can I have your flag? You know, you don't need it. You've just finished demonstrating." And I think that now I would be dishonest if I were to say that is typical of the atmosphere in Israel today. It is not. There is deep, deep bitterness and suspicion. At the same time, we are still capable of those small gestures that define us as a family, however dysfunctional. It's also interesting that what has happened on the streets is that the demonstrations grow from week to week. And they're also growing and expanding in terms of the kinds of Israelis who are being drawn in. When you go to the demonstration in Tel Aviv, it's left-wing secular or centrist secular for the most part. In Jerusalem, half kippot, half religious Jews. In the last weeks, there have been demonstrations on a weekly basis in Efrat, the settlement of Efrat. They're not large, a few hundred people, but symbolically very important. Because this is not coming from the left, even though Netanyahu wants to portray it as such. It's coming from the center, from the strong center of the Israeli political map. And I'll have more to say in a little while about the center. This is a confusing moment because we're experiencing an overlapping of issues. What obviously triggered the demonstrations was the assault on the judiciary and the outrage at the makeup of this government. But what is underlying the debate in Israel today is a profound divide over our fundamental identity as a country. And there is something moving about the fact that on our 75th anniversary, we're finally having the debate that we probably should have had in 1951. And then we might have had a constitution had we had that debate. And the debate is really not a policy debate. You know, we're used to dividing along policy issues, settlements, peace process. This is much more basic. This is about our identity. We call ourselves a Jewish state and a democratic state. What do we mean by each of those identities? And what do we mean by the two of those identities together? How do they actually work together? How should they work together? And this government is attempting to change both of those identities. The consensus, the majority understanding of what we mean by a democratic state and a Jewish state, that I would argue has been a consensus issue from the founding of the state until Netanyahu, coincidentally or not, began to find himself in trouble with the law. And then suddenly democracy and the Supreme Court became contentious issues. And there's something surreal about experiencing this deep debate over democracy when for all these years this was a given. And you know, when I use the term liberal Israelis, and I don't mean liberal in a left-wing sense. Liberal in an Israeli context is a very broad category that ranged from Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir's Likud through the center and to labor. That is the Israeli liberal map. Now, it may sound discordant to an American sensibility, but in Israel, until the last few years, the Likud was a liberal nationalist party. And in an Israeli context, that's not an oxymoron. You can be a nationalist and a liberal. There was no greater liberal in Israeli political history than Menachem Begin, far more than Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion used the Shin Bet to spy on his political opponents. Menachem Begin would have never done that. Menachem Begin, in the opposition in the 1960s, led the parliamentary campaign to end military rule over Israel's Arab citizens, who were under military rule under the supposedly good old days of the Labor Party, which many American Jews have a nostalgia for. But I would argue that at least within the Green Line, Israel was a far more liberal country under the Likud, under the old Likud, than it was under the Labor Party. What has changed, of course, is that Netanyahu has now aligned the Likud with the far right. His first step was to empower the far right, to bring them into his coalition, and ultimately he transformed the Likud itself from a liberal nationalist party into a populist far-right party. The debate that we're having today over democracy is, how do you define majority rule? Does a majority have the right to do whatever it decides? If you win an election, as this government did, does winner take all? This government is saying yes. We won the election, and to oppose us is to oppose the democratic process. The liberal understanding of democracy is that there's a delicate dance between the rights of the majority and the rights of a minority. When the government says that the court is an undemocratic institution, they're right. That's its purpose. Its purpose is to be a check on runaway power of an elected majority. And so there's a profound disagreement of what we mean by democracy. Israeli democracy is a miracle. There's no democracy anywhere that was born in war and never knew effectively a day of peace, that has been under such relentless security pressure, not only from enemies who oppose it or who seek land, but who seek to destroy it. And then when you bring in wave after wave of refugees from parts of the world, whether Eastern Europe or the Middle East, with little or no democratic experience, into this permanent pressure cooker. And the result is not only that democracy holds, but the democratic institutions actually got stronger over the years. But when I say that Israeli democracy is a miracle, I'm not only saying that in a celebratory sense, but with a certain anxiety. Because a miracle is a defiance of the laws of nature. A miracle has to be protected. And when you have your own democratically elected government assaulting democratic institutions and the country's democratic ethos, how durable can democracy be? Now, Israel is not a paragon of pure democracy, and we never were. We never were because we can't be. A country that faces the kinds of security threats that we routinely deal with cannot be a representative, an embodiment of pure democracy. We're constantly mediating between democratic norms and security needs. But we are a paragon of the struggle for democracy under near impossible circumstances. What makes Israeli democracy so precious, and I would argue so important for the world, is because this is the test case of democracy under extremity. This is what happens when you subject democracy to relentless pressure. And so in that sense, the fault lines of Israeli democracy, the places where we failed, are no less instructive than the places where we succeed. Israel is a laboratory, and that's what's so precious about what we've created. And that is what I fear this government would upend. Precisely that delicate balance, that search for decency, under conditions that I believe would have defeated almost any country in our place. How long would any country in Europe have lasted having to deal with the kinds of security threats that we do? And so what we're fighting for today in Israel is to maintain that precious experiment in which Israel becomes a paragon of the balancing democratic norms with overwhelming security threats. The second identity issue that is on the table, and I believe is going to become more and more prominent in the coming months, is what do we mean by a Jewish state? Now, unlike the consensus that prevailed in Israel until the last few years on democracy, and when I say consensus, I mean a strong majority of Israelis took for granted the liberal definition of democracy. The opponents of this liberal definition were the hard right and the ultra-Orthodox, and they have always been in the minority. The second issue, the Jewish identity of the state, has been deeply argued, has been the source of our deepest internal divide, not only from the founding of the state, but in the decades before the state was created, in the Yishuv, in the pre-state Jewish community. We were always deeply divided over the question of whether Israel should be the state of the Jewish people, or in addition to the state of the Jewish people, the state of Judaism. And in particular, one denomination of Judaism, Orthodox Judaism. The classical Zionist mainstream answer to this question, going back to the founding of Zionism, was that Israel was meant to be the state of the Jewish people, all of the Jewish people, the whole mess. Who we are, for better, for worse, that is the state of Israel. The great achievement of Rabbinic Judaism was that it held the Jewish people together through the exile for 1,700 years, until the 19th century. It gave us a shared identity and a shared language. A Jew could travel the length and breadth of the diaspora, east and west, north and south, in the Middle Ages, and feel reasonably at home in almost any diaspora, maybe the two exceptions that I can think of are the Ethiopian Jewish community and the Indian Jewish community, where rabbinic Judaism didn't reach. Everywhere else, this is an astonishing achievement, and the Jewish people owes rabbinic Judaism its life, its existence. But this achievement of uniting the Jewish people broke down irrevocably in the 19th century. And religion stopped being the uniting principle and became the most divisive part of our identity. We were blessed to have Zionism come along at precisely that point in the 19th century to offer us an alternative vision of a unifying Jewish identity. And this is an aspect of Zionism that has been, I think, too neglected. Zionism was not only about empowering the Jewish people, restoring sovereignty, recreating the Hebrew language, reestablishing Jewish defense. It was also about redefining how we unite as a people. And the Zionist definition of who is a Jew is whoever is a Jew. And without applying a microscope. And this was a revolutionary idea, and there is good reason for why almost the entire ultra-Orthodox world in pre-Holocaust Europe opposed Zionism, because they understood just how radical, how revolutionary Zionism was. The embodiment of this revolutionary principle that what unites the Jewish people is the Jewish people, this is our unifying identity, is the law of return. The law of return is a far more radical principle of defining who we are than the Reform movement's patrilineal descent. The law of return offers Israeli citizenship to anyone with a single grandfather, single grandparent. And while the law of return isn't technically a definition of who is a Jew, in practice, that is exactly what it has done. And we see it with the Soviet immigration, where hundreds of thousands among the million plus came in under the grandfather clause and were absorbed into Jewish Israeli society. So it was under the grandfather clause that part of the Jewish people that had been most estranged, forcibly kept from the Jewish people, was reunited in the most far-reaching way, the most profound way. Now, it's true that Zionism and the secular state went a long way to accommodating the camp that defines who is a Jew in classical rabbinic Orthodox terms. And I would define Israel as a secular state with too many religious laws. Something like maybe like Ireland or Italy of 2 generations ago. Something like that. But Israel always insisted on defining itself at its core as a secular state. That is the source of our success as a modern country. And we honor Judaism, we give Orthodox Judaism preeminence, to my taste, far too much preeminence. Nevertheless, I think that the secular state has gone a very long way to accommodating the camp that sees Israel as the state not only of the Jewish people, but of Orthodox Judaism. The one law that most defines Israel as the state of the Jewish people and not the state of Orthodox Judaism is the law of return. And that's precisely what this government intends to amend. So the next great fight that's heading our way is going to be over how we define admission into the state of Israel. if we define it in an expansive Zionist way, and I insist on calling this a Zionist definition, or in a non-Zionist way, which is reverting back to the basis of Jewish unity, the religious basis that worked for us for 1,700 years and broke down in modernity. Some opponents of the protest movement have tried to define this moment as a clash between those who favor a post-Jewish, post-Zionist, secular democratic state versus those who are upholding the integrity of Israel as a Jewish state. This, to my mind, is a profound distortion of what is happening in this moment. What we are arguing about is not whether Israel should be a Jewish state, but what kind of Jewish state we should be. And for me, the definition of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is that, first of all, and I insist on this hierarchy of order, Israel is, first of all, the state of every Jew in the world, whether or not they are citizens of Israel. And secondly, it is the state of all of its citizens, whether or not they are Jews. The state of all Jews, whether or not they are citizens, the state of all of its citizens, whether or not they are Jews. Tov, how much time do I have left? I've lost total track. I have another 2 hours of material, I'm afraid. 10 minutes? He says 10 or 15. I'm sorry, I'm taking 15. Okay, so the nation-state law, the Jewish nation-state law that was passed in, I believe, 2017, was right to define Israel as the state of the Jewish people, but it was only half right, because it didn't define Israel at the same time as a democracy. Now, those who supported the law say it wasn't necessary to define Israel as a democracy because we have a series of basic laws that define the rights of the individual. So far, we have a series of basic laws that are democratic. But my argument is that what the nation-state law does is define the essence, the identity of the state. And you can't define the state of Israel with only half of its identity. Then it becomes dangerously incomplete. Now, there are unavoidable tensions in these two definitions. And I can't think of any other state in the world that's quite like that. And in that sense, in our connection to world Jewry, we are an abnormal state. And as a democracy, we're a normal state. And we're going to have to balance. That is the essence of Israeli identity, maintaining the tension between being a normal state, like other states, and being a unique state, which is represented by our connection to a transnational people. Now, Zionism not only took responsibility for recreating the Jewish people, it also created a new people called the Israelis. Now, obviously, there's a great deal of overlap between these two peoples, but they are not entirely identical. And it seems to me that in the religious Zionist community, there's a great difficulty in understanding the difference between a state, a modern state, and a people. There is overlap, but they cannot be identical, because then you are disenfranchising citizens who don't belong to that people. By the same token, just as an aside, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, have a separate problem. They confuse a community for a people. They look at the Jewish people and see a reflection of themselves and believe that they are not only the heart of the Jewish people, but really, in some ways, the only authentic expression of the Jewish people. And so the religious Zionists, by and large, are more expansive in their understanding of the Jewish people, to some extent, but don't have that sense of an expanse, don't have an expansive idea of a modern state. And so this, to my mind, is part of what's being played out in this clash. Seeing Israel as a Jewish state, which means the state of the whole people and not only a community within the Jewish people, not only the Orthodox community, and seeing the state of Israel as a modern construct that doesn't only belong to the Jewish people, but belongs to all of its citizens. Now, there are deep tensions between Jewish and democratic. An Arab citizen will never be able to really identify with the founding ethos of the state, which is the ingathering of the exiles. That is antithetical to what Arab Israelis want. Let's be honest about it. That sense of alienation from the national identity is reinforced by the state symbols, which are relentlessly Jewish. It's hard really to think of neutral Israeli symbols. And I think as the state evolves, we're going to need to figure out how do we preserve the Jewish symbols of the state and expand and create some place for Israeli symbols. And what will that mean? I believe that there are 4 indispensable elements to the Jewishness of a Jewish state. Excuse me. The first, of course, is the law of return, and that is the most indispensable of all of the elements defining us as a Jewish state. The second is that Israel has created a public space that is defined by the Hebrew calendar, the Hebrew language, by Jewish issues, a Jewish public space. Not exclusively, because we have minorities and we need to continue not just making place, but expanding the place within our public space for our minorities. And the third is the symbols. The symbols of the state need to reflect our Jewish identity. And finally, our connections with world Jewry, the sense of responsibility for the Jewish people, of protectiveness toward the Jewish people, and of seeing ourselves as the continuity of a 4,000-year story. We're not just 75 years old. At the same time, and that's a lot, that to me is a very heavy load for a democratic state to carry. We have no choice. That's our essence. But at the same time, I think we need to be mindful of what a burden that we impose on the Arab citizens of Israel. And we need to be thinking of ways not to expand the official Jewish imprint, but to contract it where we can. This government's instincts are precisely the opposite. This government wants to expand and expand and expand the Jewishness of the state. And that seems to me antithetical to Israel's best long-term interests, which require the absorption, to whatever extent is possible, of Arab citizens into some sense of shared civic Israeli identity. To sum up, actually not to sum up, a new idea, but I'm concluding, I'm moving toward the end. Don't worry. This is potentially one of the most positive moments in Israeli history. And I say that because it has forced us not only to deal with identity issues that we must confront, but also to deal with long simmering distortions in the Israeli system. I'm thinking, for example, of the ultra-Orthodox state within a state, which is growing exponentially, and which this government is substantially strengthening. The previous government was beginning to make inroads into bringing parts of the Haredi community into the mainstream, and this government has completely overturned those achievements. And then there's the question of settler violence. Now, for years, I was among those who dismissed the seriousness of settler violence as a fringe. So it's a few lunatics uprooting olive trees of their Palestinian neighbors. With this government, that fringe has entered the heart of Israeli power. Smotrich and Ben Gvir are the patrons of the farthest fringe of the Israeli right. What happened a few weeks ago in Hawara, in the Palestinian village of Hawara, where hundreds of settlers burned dozens of Palestinian homes, was not a fringe phenomenon. And so we are now beginning to face a disgraceful phenomenon that we have allowed to fester under successive Israeli governments, left, right, and center. What we're experiencing today on the streets is the rise of a passionate center. Now, the problem with a political center is a kind of amorphous quality. The center usually lacks passion, as the poet told us. And the passion usually belongs to the extremes. That's finished. The center in Israel today is no less passionate, no less militant than the extremes. This is an extraordinary moment in Israeli history. What the center, and I speak as somebody who is a passionate militant centrist, the center has moved from a mood to an ideology. And that ideology is what I've tried to lay out here. A commitment to a liberal understanding, a classical Zionist understanding of Israel as a Jewish state and a democratic state, and insisting on the non-negotiable entwinement of these two identities. On the left, there is a wavering about a Jewish state. On the right, we're seeing the erosion of support for a democratic state. It's the center that will fight and preserve, I believe, the integrity of these two identities. If we'd waited too long, if we'd waited another 10 years or 20 years to begin confronting issues like settler violence, like the ultra-Orthodox separatism, it might have been too late. And the good news is, the potentially good news is, that I believe it's not too late. And I think that this movement has arisen just at the moment when it's still possible to salvage the Israel that we've known for 75 years. How will Israeli society be healed after this traumatic schism, the deepest schism that we've ever known? And deeper even, I would argue, than the Rabin assassination, because that was over policy. This is over identity. This is over the foundation. I believe that we'll have to wait for the post-Netanyahu era for real healing to begin, to reestablish the broad Zionist center, which still reflects a majority of the Israeli public. And I say that based on the polls that we're seeing. This government, in the last 4 or 5 months, has gone down in the polls from 64 seats to 48. I have never seen that kind of decline in so short a time in 40 years of observing Israeli politics. Something extraordinary is happening, and I believe that what's happening is that the democratic right that votes for the Likud is saying, wait a minute, this isn't really what we signed up for. We vote for the Likud because you promised security, and now security is worse, far worse than it was under the last government, which was supposedly a Muslim Brotherhood government, as Netanyahu characterized it. And instead, we're seeing an agenda that you, Netanyahu, didn't reveal during the election campaign. You didn't tell us that this was coming. The far right was candid. Netanyahu was very cagey when he'd be asked, so what is your plan for the judicial system? We're going to proceed responsibly. We're going to look for consensus. Don't worry. You know, we're responsible. And so many Israeli voters today feel this isn't what we signed up for. And I believe that we will reestablish that broad Zionist center, that broad liberal camp that includes large parts of the Likud. And we will restore the far right to its natural place on the fringes of Israeli politics. There's a deeper discussion here about how we renew our capacity as a society for mutual empathy. Right now, very few Israelis are able, and I include myself in this category, able to really listen to the arguments of the other side. And that's a very dangerous, well, you know, that's a very dangerous place for a country to be in. And we can't afford to be there because we happen to have Hezbollah and Hamas on our borders, and Iran is in Syria. And this is the Iranian nexus. And we all know that war could break out at any moment, which would make everything that I've just said here in some ways irrelevant until it becomes relevant again. And so we can't afford to indulge in the kinds of contemptuous politics that really now defines American discourse. As angry as I am at the government and their supporters, I cannot call my fellow Israelis deplorables. Then there's no basis for solidarity any longer. And so we're going to have to start figuring out how do we renew our capacity for conversation. My last word, really last, is that we're going to win. And I'm saying it not out of bravado, but based on the mood in the streets. What began as an outpouring of despair in those first weeks has turned into a celebration. And go look at some of the clips of the Independence Day celebration in Tel Aviv last night with several 100,000 protesters celebrating the victory of their Israel. This Pesach at our family Seder, we dedicated the theme of Cherut, of freedom, to imagining that we've already won in Israel. And the Seder became a celebration for the endurance of Israeli democracy. And that's the spirit that you find in Israel today. And I believe that we are going to be more determined than this government. And the moment when in retrospect, the moment when I realized that this was true was the very first big demonstration. Some of you may recall there was a downpour in Tel Aviv, and 90,000 people came. I have never been more drenched in my life. We're under an umbrella, and yet nobody moved. Nobody even commented about what we were actually experiencing. We were just determined, that same determination with which Israelis have defended the country from external threat was being expressed in the streets. And that's why I believe that we're going to win. And I think that one day we're going to look back at this moment and say, this is the time when liberal Israel reasserted itself and Israeli democracy was renewed. Thank you very much.